Thank you, everyone, and sorry, and the slide seems to have something went wrong, but very nice to be here. My name is Cecilia Emilsson, and I am a policy analyst at the OECD. So the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have 38 member countries, and we work on a wide range of topics, including digital identity. And just, if you can't read, this session is called A Cross-Border Digital Identity, Insights from the G7 Mapping Exercise of Digital Identity Approaches. And I don't have the clicker. Does anyone have the clicker? Is there a click? The clicker?
Are the slides not?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Sorry. So the purpose of this presentation and this mapping, we talked a lot about fragmentation and the importance of interoperability across borders. So what we're going to share today and this report that you can access online, it was an exercise between a small set of countries, like the G7. So last year under the Italian G7 presidency, we developed this report together. The OECD supported the G7 countries. So, and the G7 countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, so Italy, France, and Germany, Japan, and Canada. And the European Commission also is represented. So it was, the purpose of the mapping was to try to find sort of a common mapping and understanding of the digital identity frameworks across these countries, sort of as an ends to a mean. It's it's a small exercise to start the discussion on cross-border interoperability, and it was released in October last year. So I'm here with my colleagues, and we will move to the next slide, and I will share first the word to Connie from the US.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes, great. So hi, it's nice to see a lot of you familiar faces, and nice to meet those of you who I haven't met yet. I'm Connie Lasalle with the U.S. National Institute for Standards and Technology. I lead a team of technologists, including our identity program. And I'm also a contributor to our digital identity guidelines, which I know many of you know. The story of the G7 mapping exercise really started even smaller. And I think that's one big lesson learned as a person who's been in both government and private sector for her career, is that you can't boil the ocean. You really need to start small, intentional, find some commonalities, get on the same page. And on the US side, NIST, along with another delegation of US government agencies, sought to first do that with the European Commission, noting our mutual interest in the topic of identity, including identity from a risk management perspective. So we started by first getting on the same page about concepts, terms, definitions, so that we weren't talking past each other and talking past each other's contexts, because contexts will remain different. It's the one beautiful thing about the world that we live in. The next thing we wanted to do was get on the same page about what we mean by assurance levels. One notable difference between the NIST digital identity guidelines and other frameworks that you'll hear about, including those on this stage, is that we made the intentional decision to break out levels of assurance into assurance levels for identity proofing and enrollment, authentication and credential lifecycle management, and federation, which we'll maintain in revision 4 once it's out. So we wanted to map, and specifically what do we mean by levels of assurance? The components that we identified very specifically were evidence requirements, evidence requirements, which for us will include attributes, validation requirements on the evidence and the attributes, the verification methods that are allowed, how does issuance and binding work, what are those requirements, and then finally authentication. So when you hear us talking about LOA or IAL, AAL comparisons, it's really on those 5 key components that we based the mapping. And last but not least, because we are an international community, we wanted to know what standards are people leveraging. So we also did that mapping as well. So I'll leave it at that. You can see the specific reference material from the NIST digital identity guidelines that we used. Again, it's the base volume for core concepts, volume A for identity proofing, and then volume B for authentication and lifecycle management. One thing I will note on our recent updates, which will be recent soon, in revision 4, as part of the underlying concepts for risk management, the definitions, the underlying assumptions for how you manage digital identities and the risks associated with them, is the acknowledgement of the particular identity model that we're talking about today and tomorrow, which is wallet-based, it's credential-based, but I also want to acknowledge that NIST's approach does not necessarily assume or prescribe that model. It assumes lots of different ways to achieve your outcomes. So with that, I will stop talking and yield the floor to my colleague from the UK.
Can you hear me now? Yes. So my name's Dr. Charlie Smith, and I'm the Head of Trust Framework at the UK Government's Office for Digital Identities and Attributes. We call it OfDIA for short. And at OfDIA, we're basically working to enable the trusted use of digital identities across the whole UK, predominantly to drive economic growth, but we're really careful to try and do this in a way that maintains choice and security control for the user, like everyone else, I suppose. But importantly, a bit like what Connie was saying, we focus on doing what we think only government can do. So that's helping build trust in digital identity, but leaving the market and providers in the market to innovate, to develop the actual products. So it's important to understand that we don't develop any products ourselves. And the Trust Framework, which I manage, the UK Digital Identities and Attributes Trust Framework, short name, is nothing more than a kind of set of roles, principles, standards, policies that defines what we think a good digital identity looks like. Providers can then choose to be independently certified against those rules, and I'm pleased to say we've got over 50 providers now certified, and they're doing millions of checks a year in the UK. So that's only going to keep growing, we think. When it comes to the mapping and interoperability, I think we're really committed to ensuring that alignment with our international partners. And if you read the Trust Framework, it points to standards from NIST, from ISO, from ETSI, from FIDO, many others. And in a similar way to the US, we publish our guidance on identity proofing and authentication separately. And this is where the confidence levels, or we call them levels of confidence, levels of protection come from in our system. And then we have further guidance on things like delegated authority, accepting vouchers, how to check attributes, that kind of thing. And I think the kind of key update I just want to say today was that since the mapping exercise, we've actually released the new version of the Trust Framework. So the Gamma or 0.4 publication came out last week in its final form, and as of today, the 1st of July, you can, as a provider, be certified against these rules. And we've made lots of changes for this new version, but I mean, the bones of it have stayed the same. But I wanted to quickly highlight two things before I finish up. So first, we added 2 new roles for providers to play. The first one is the holder service provider, which, as you can imagine, supports wallets, as well as personal data stores and other kind of holder services. And given this audience, I think that's particularly relevant. But the other role we added was the component service provider role, which I think is relatively novel. And this is for companies that specialize in doing only parts of the process. So say you just do facial biometric scan. You can get certified as doing just that part of the process and sell that into other companies. And we're hoping that this allows for kind of flexibility in the market. Second big thing is then we added a lot around biometric testing, performance and security testing, that kind of thing, and pushing people towards third-party accredited labs. And I sort of wanted to flag that I'm really interested, if you come and find me later, I want to hear about injection attacks. I think we're really worried about AI deepfakes, as everyone is. And so we're keen to add something about injection attacks in the next version, as well as kind of ensuring alignment with MDL standards, which one of my colleagues here would love to talk to you about. So yeah, do come find me if you'd like to talk to that, and I will pass over to Anthony.
Thank you. I'm Anthony Carmoy, working for France Identité, France Titres, an agency of the Ministry of the Interior. So I think Europe has a long history in making a mapping exercise between the different member states. That was basically the intent with EIDAS 1, which then has been amended last year to EIDAS 2, which of course, and with the coming of the OfDIA wallet, I think all the eyes are turned towards Europe. This mapping, I think, is quite important for us. You mentioned, Charlie, the different definitions, and looking at the regulation, it always starts with all the different definitions. And looking from a standardization perspective, it's quite difficult to commonly agree with Japan, with the US, on what exactly is this component, what is this item in the wallet. The other document, which is of importance in the mapping, is the implementing regulation 1502. This is basically a document that says this is LOA low. On top of that, if you add those components, you achieve substantial, and then you have high. And these are basically the most critical, I think, synergies that we have to find between one group and another. But speaking from an implementer's perspective, because France Identité is the app that we want to become the OfDIA wallet for France, let me start with an example. Did you know that the fifth biggest French city actually is London? We have like more than 300K French people living there. So like to stress, like for this, it's very important for us. And this leads to two observations. First is we've come a long way since you took Napoleon from us. And the second one would be that for us, for France Identité, we have to provide those people first with an ID. So over the last few weeks, we enabled the different consulates all around the world to be able to issue an LOA high according to EIDAS EID into the France Identité app. But then what I think is the most important is the mapping of the use cases, both domestic use cases for pension, for example, but then local use cases, and we're actively working on making France Identité going beyond the different national, but also European borders. Thank you.
Thank you. And we had two more frameworks covered in this mapping. Thank you, first of all, for the introduction. So we don't have so much time left, but I will try to go through. So unfortunately, colleagues from Japan and Canada couldn't join us. But we work with the Digital Agency of Japan, and they were in part of the framework mapping they provided, and they were very helpful in providing the requirements and the framework of the guidelines for online identity verification methods within the public sector. So they were also mapped across the other frameworks explained. And I will briefly go to the next slide, please. And then for Canada, we have the Directive on Identity Management, which is part of their government policy, federal government policy for government security. And below that, there were several guidelines and standards on identity assurance and authentication requirements that were also covered as part of the mapping. But a tip is to read the report online, that there you can see everything very detailedly explained. And looking at the actual mapping, so as Connie described, we first looked at the concepts and definitions, and we compare those. So we looked in total at 10 different concepts, and very quickly we found that there was quite a good of a matching, and some were almost identical. And just to see here, there are some results for authoritative source. There are some differences, but in general, there's sort of quite the same understanding of these type of concepts. The next slide. When we come to the levels of assurance, as Connie and the others also explained, we looked at different sort of, we divided up in two different parts, identity proofing and authentication, and we'll map different types of requirements across these frameworks to see how do the countries align, which is sort of the baseline to start discussing interoperability, right? And we see that there were some differences in terms of how the level of assurance were defined, how many levels there were, and so forth, and it's all in the mapping. And when we look at the results, we saw that at the lower levels of assurance, there was quite a lot of similarities, more so, but of course, as you go to higher levels of assurance, it becomes more and more different, and this is where we saw that there could be greater focus. Next slide. And for the international technical standards references, we mapped the use of 50 technical standards, international standards, across these authoritative documents. And we didn't see any overlap across all G7 members, but we saw a few overlaps between at least 2 of them. And just so the final, now I actually have 4 minutes, so I went a bit too quick. Sorry. So just all of these details are in the report, and we have several annexes where you can go more into detail if you're interested and looking at these. Of course, there has been some updates, but it's still a good document, I think, to get a better understanding of these requirements across these countries. So looking at the concepts and definitions, we saw that there were alignment, despite that there were differences in the type of documents, the scope of the documents. For example, the European Union having the legislation and the implementing acts versus guideline. So we still saw that this is a good basis for more detailed discussion on these type of concepts and how you describe it to support interoperability. Looking at the levels of assurance, as I said before, the main differences exist at higher levels of assurance. For example, the evidence requirements, the type of evidence, and we think, as said in the document, that there could be an opportunity here to work more and collaborate more, focusing on higher assurance levels. And finally, for the technical standards references, I think here we see quite few overlaps. And I think this is a part of the whole conference today, to talk also about technical standards and how we interoperate, that there could be more done here to really map and define the relevance of different international technical standards that can help countries collaborate and work towards interoperability in the future.